Hello, good to see you. Pastor Sam with a reflection on being friends, and especially friends with people who might not believe in Jesus, like you. And so the reason oh my goodness, wow, the reason we're talking about this today is that I kind of got this question recently. Someone was talking to me, and they were studying the Bible, a good thing to do, and they just kind of wondered in general about being friends with unbelievers. And is there a time where maybe it's a good idea to do that, and a time where it might not be a good idea, and you might need to break off that friendship or that relationship? And so I gave him a kind of a quick answer. I've thought about it a little bit more, and fortunately, I still stand by my quick answer, but I want to cover it here in this format and talk a little bit about why we might want to be friends, especially with unbelievers, and then when it might be a bad idea to continue being friends, and when you should think about maybe not being friends with that person any longer. And so the first thing that I want to cover is why we would be friends with them, and put my hand up in a place you can see. The answer might be a little bit surprising. Probably an answer that you're thinking is so we can tell them about Jesus, which is not necessarily the first answer. All right, so let me say the first answer, and then we'll kind of get around to it. The reason why you might want to be friends with an unbeliever is to do kind and loving things for them. That's the first reason, the primary reason. So you can do kind and loving things. We talked about this yesterday. I do my devotions sort of out of order sometimes, so I can't really remember. Yeah, I think it was yesterday. Jesus talks about, if you didn't tune in yesterday, go watch that devotion. But Jesus talks about, he's at the final judgment, and he separates the sheep and the goats, and he says, I was hungry and you fed me, I was naked and you clothed me, I was sick and you visited me. And the righteous answer, basically, when did that happen, Jesus? And Jesus says, as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. So that is what our Lord thinks is important about, not necessarily being friends, but doing things for other people, is that display of love for them, which for us as Christians is love for Jesus Christ. So that is the first and most important reason why we would have any relationship at all, is to be able to do kind and loving things for them, not to them. Because that kind of leads into, and I want to talk a little bit about the other reason, and then bring them back and kind of compare a little bit. The reason that might have popped into your head is in order to tell them about Jesus, which is not necessarily a wrong or a bad thing, but it does have a problem. The problem is it objectifies the person, and it treats them as a thing you want to convert. In this case, you want them to believe in Jesus, and if they do believe in Jesus, that's good, but if they don't believe in Jesus, then that's bad, which is still a true thing, but you're not treating that person as a person, you're treating them as a thing that you want to influence or convince or argue against or whatever. And so you're going to base the success and failure of that relationship then upon whether they become a Christian or not. And so maybe, and here's kind of the long-range danger. Maybe you're friends with this person, you've been friends with them for, let's just throw out, 10 years, 20 years. In that whole time, they have not wanted to become a Christian. You've been, telling them about Jesus, doing kind and loving things to them in the hope that they become a Christian. And eventually, after 20 years, you throw up your hands and you're like, you're never going to become a Christian. I'm done with you, right? You're treating that, in that case, you're treating the person like an object. And because they refuse to become a Christian, which is still a bad thing, because they refuse to become a Christian, now you're no longer going to show them love. You're no longer going to do kind and loving things for them because of something that they have done. This might sound very, very subtle and nuanced, and I'm trying to make it a little clearer. The reason why we would be friends with anyone is again, to show our love for Christ, which is love for our neighbor. Not necessarily, not first and foremost, to tell them about Jesus, because that goal objectifies them. Now, a kind and loving thing you might do is tell them about Jesus. But here's kind of the first part, and then we'll transition into the second part. If that's one of the kind and loving things, if they seem very hesitant, and perhaps they don't ever become a Christian, you can still do other kind and loving things. You can still tell them about Jesus, because ultimately, whether they decide to trust him or not is their decision. You can still do other kind and loving things for them. You can continue the friendship, even if they would have no desire at all to be a Christian. And while that's kind of a poor choice on their part, on your part, you're fulfilling Christ's desire and word for you in showing love to other people, giving food to the hungry, clothing to the naked, visiting people who are sick or in prison, that kind of thing. So you're still able to do kind and loving things, and you're not treating that person like an object, but you're treating them like a person who has a variety of needs. One of them being a spiritual need, if they're not a Christian, right? The need for God, but they might not want to fulfill that need, at least not in the way that we as Christians fulfill that need. But they do have other needs too that you can be helping them with. So again, I'm gonna try to re-summarize this. We aren't friends with non-believers so that we can tell them about Jesus. The other problem with that is, what if they do become a Christian? What do we do with that relationship? All right, great. They believed in Jesus. I'm going to check them off my list. I'm never going to talk to that person again. See you later. So long. I'm done with you. Right? Which is not a very Christian thing to do, if I can just generally throw that out. If they do happen to become a Christian, your goal is complete. Right? If we're thinking about the idea of conversion, and you'll be on to another object, another person, to try to convert. Whereas, if you are doing kind and loving things for them, like Jesus says in Matthew 25, you will continue to do kind and loving things. In this case, you won't need to tell them about Jesus anymore. Or maybe you will still tell them about Jesus, just like you and I continue to watch these devotions, come to worship, read God's word, right? We continue to hear about Jesus. So, you might still tell them about Jesus. But the first goal, the best reason for being friends, or really having any relationship at all, is for you to do kind and loving things to that person. And one of them is telling them about Jesus. I guess whether they're Christians or not, that's still a kind and loving thing, telling someone about Jesus. Now, kind of transitioning into, so let's kind of set up the example, right? You are friends with a person, they are not a Christian, and let's kind of talk about whether and when and if you should no longer be friends with them. Because that's, again, kind of where the person's question came from, and so I do want to address that. And one of the things that I said is, you can continue to be friends with them until it puts a risk upon yourself. And I'll kind of explain a little bit more what I mean about that. So let's say this person's, let me back up a little bit. I'm trying to frame this whole thing to get at the answer. Let's say this person's like sin or wrong thing. I hate to just do this. It really oversimplifies it, but I think I kind of have to. This person is doing something that has never really tempted you. I don't want to throw out examples. I don't think that's going to be overly helpful. But the like pet sin that this person has is completely different from the pet sin that you have. Because each one of us has kind of a pet sin, a thing that we keep doing, that we keep falling back into. Anyway, the person that you are friends with has a pet sin that in no way tempts you or causes you harm, you're like, nope, I have no attraction to that whatsoever, right? I would never be caught dead doing that pet sin. In that case, there is very little risk to you of succumbing to that sin or having like another pet sin that you would have. And again, examples might be helpful, but then we're going to have to qualify them, and I'll be talking forever just to try to get through the example. So if the person with whom you are friends has a pet sin that doesn't really affect you, that you've never thought about or been tempted by, then there's very low risk to you of falling headlong into that sin, and ultimately very little risk of you losing your faith. That's kind of where we're at. But, and so let me say the full thing. In that case, you could be friends with them like for the foreseeable future, right? Because you can continue to do kind and loving things for them with very little risk of their own faithlessness or sinfulness kind of sucking you in. Now, there may reach a point, or there may already be, in a certain relationship, a pet sin that you struggle with, right? Perhaps this friend has a pet sin that is the same as yours, or is kind of similar to yours, and so there is great risk of you succumbing to that sin, falling into it, being sucked in to the alluring power of sin, and ultimately diminishing or even losing your faith. That is the risk. That's the risk with any sin, but especially when it's your pet sin that you wrestle with and you struggle with, and even without the extra influence of another person, you still manage to commit, right? And each of us have these pet sins. They're different for everybody. So if you have a friend who is constantly doing that thing that tempts you, they may not be saying, hey, you should come do this wrong thing with me, but just by you being with them, they'll probably talk about it or invite you to go do whatever thing, whatever that pet sin is. There is higher risk to you getting sucked in to that pet sin. And even though you may be wrestling with it, and you may give into it sometimes, and you may resist sometimes, if you have a friend or friends who are doing that particular thing, you're going to be drawn into it. And the risk increases. Again, we're going with high risk, low risk, higher risk, lower risk. There's no hard and fast rule in any of this. I can't just give a broad sweep and say, here's what you need to do 100% of the time. This is like an 80% rule. 80% of the time, this rule is going to hold. 20% of the time, it's going to be useless, and you'll have to kind of feel your way on your own. But anyway, so if the person with whom you are friends has a pet sin that is the same or similar to yours, you are at great risk. And this is one of those moments where you might need to sever that relationship, finding other people with whom to do kind and loving things towards, because the risk to yourself is too great. So one of the kind of fallacies, right? One of the kind of twisted logics is, I'm going to be friends with that person because I struggle with that same thing, and I can be a really good witness to them in this thing. Which again kind of gets back to what I was talking about at the beginning. You are not friends with someone so that you can convert them. You're friends with them in order for you to do kind and loving things. Now, you can do kind and loving things to any individual. It doesn't necessarily have to be to this person, which gives us a freedom that if this person is pulling you in to that sin that you struggle with, then you're just going to turn and find someone else to do kind and loving things to. And you can fulfill our Lord's words of doing, how many times have I said kind and loving things, without falling victim to additional sin, without without the risk of reducing or losing your faith. That's ultimately the most valuable and the most important part of this. And so there's this idea of, no, I can be a really good witness, but again, that's objectifying the other person, staking your relationship with them upon that moment of conversion, and that's not what we want to do. We want to be doing kind and loving things to whomsoever we might come into contact with. So even though it might seem noble or honorable to be in that situation, ultimately you don't want to take chances with your faith. And you need to, at bottom, worry about your faith, right? If I go around and I do kind and loving things, and all kinds of people believe in Jesus, but then at the end I lose my faith, then like, what benefit is that to me? I know that's a little bit selfish, but I want to go to heaven when I die, right? And I'm very concerned about that. I mean, that's a very high priority for me. Let me say it that way. I'm not concerned about my salvation. But that's a high priority for me, that I remain faithful. And then since I am faithful, my secondary priority is that people around me be faithful. So I'm not willing to put my own faith at risk. And here's my recommendation. This is not a rule, but a recommendation. You should not put your own faith at risk for the sake of any other person, right? If it's kind of down to that them or you, this is a moment where you need to be selfish. And you need to worry about your own faith first. Because if you end up losing it for the sake of another person, I don't know. I'm hesitant to call that foolish. No, that is foolish. That's the exact definition of foolishness, is losing faith. So that's, there we go. Literally a foolish thing to do, to give up your own faith for the sake, so that someone else can be converted or have faith, right? Foolish thing to do. So if, again, kind of bringing back the summary, if that other person's pet sin is very similar to yours, I highly encourage you to find other people to do kind and loving things to. But if that person's pet sin is not one that you were tempted by, or is not appealing to you or whatever, then go ahead and continue to be friends with them so that you can do, anyone? Bueller? Yes, kind and loving things. That's exactly right. So you can do kind and loving things to them. There we go. That's kind of the question in a nutshell. Now again, like I said, this is an 80% rule. Most of the time, this is going to hold true. Just sort of as a conventional wisdom, this is not a rule. This is certainly not something that God talks about directly. It's something that he kind of hints at, and so I'm pulling together some hints from God to arrive at this recommendation. But I do again highlight, it's my recommendation, definitely not one of God's laws, and 20% of the time I'm going to be wrong. And you should either still be friends with them or not be friends with them regardless, right? So, as in most things, I'm extremely useful, but utterly useless. Because I give you a general guidance, but with the specific case, you're going to have to look at all of the different qualifications and all the different specific whatevers to arrive at a conclusion. But at its core, what is the risk to your faith? That's kind of what it comes down to. Is there low risk of you falling into additional sin and losing your faith, or is there high risk? And if there's high risk, you can find other people to do kind and loving things to, and it doesn't have to be particularly be that person. But if there's low risk, then you can remain in that relationship, and they can be a recipient of your kind and loving things. There we go. I think that more or less answers the question. I'm sure there's going to be particular. If you are in this kind of situation, I'd love for you to come discuss it with me. Because again, if there's specifics, I can give a little more a little better guidance on what I think you should do. This is just kind of a general rule. So, God's peace be with you. I'll see you next time.